Good day. Today is Saturday, 14th June 2025, and we are in the second day of the Israel-Iran war. And I'm going to make a rather bold statement, which is that I think that as the dust settles on the initial Israeli strikes, it appears to me, and of course I'm not fully expert in these things, but it appears to me that the Israeli strikes on Iran have been rather less decisive than many were suggesting at the outset, and perhaps fell somewhat short of Israeli expectations. Now, I say that because of a number of things that have happened over the last 24 hours, and that is a significant change, for example, in the tone of the commentary that we're starting to see in the Western media, from euphoria and excitement at apparent Israeli success. I've now noticed that the media in the West is now starting to walk back a bit on the initial story. But anyway, also from basically looking at exactly what Israel in fact achieved over the course of the initial strikes. Now, I'm going to say a few things here. Firstly, we don't have a complete picture. Some of the information, most of the information, is being provided by Israel. And there is no doubt at all, as we will see, that there was considerable disorganization, and this affected the Iranian reaction at the start of the operation. But firstly, Iran has rapidly filled all the vacant spots created by the Israeli attack on the senior Iranian officials. The chief of staff, the head of the IRGC, the other military commands have all been replaced. It doesn't seem to me as if the entire Iranian military leadership has been decapitated or anything like that. We've had information about the attacks on the various nuclear sites, and I think it's fair to say that though some significant damage was done to some of the facilities overall remain intact, and there's no suggestion here that Iran's nuclear program has been significantly damaged. And, well, perhaps the most interesting disclosure of all was that in the immediate hours after the initial Israeli strikes, I saw Israeli officials claim that the worst case scenario had been that Iran would respond almost immediately to the Israeli strikes, but that this was impossible. This has been rendered effectively impossible because of Israeli success in destroying the Iranian launch systems, and that the implication was that it would take some time, several days perhaps, maybe even longer, before the Iranians were able to get their act together and conduct a retaliatory strike with missiles against Israel. I saw several such claims appear across the internet, and I saw that they were also being repeated in the Israeli media as well. Well, those claims survived for just a few hours, because a few hours later, Iranian missiles started to be launched in some number, certainly in the hundreds, though it's difficult to give an exact sense of how many. And they started to fall on targets in Israel, and there was some dispute as to how successful these strikes were. The Iranians are claiming that various Israeli military facilities, including air bases and other places, were hit and were significantly damaged, and there doesn't seem to be any serious doubt that some damage was done and some missiles impacted on the Israeli city of Tel Aviv, the big Israeli city of Tel Aviv. So it's clear that the attack did not completely disable either Iran's command system. As I said, they've been able to very quickly replace all the officers, senior officers who have been killed, which suggests that Iran had already built in some measure of redundancy into its command chain, which is, by the way, entirely unsurprising. That Israeli claims to have destroyed the entire missile launching system that Iran possesses were clearly significantly overstated, with Iran able to strike at Israel and showing that it has the capability to do that. And the Iranian nuclear sites have been badly dented, but they have not been fundamentally compromised in a way that would call into question the entire viability of the Iranian nuclear program. Now, that is not to say that the Iranians have come out well from the first day. The first thing to say is that Iran's air defense system appears to have been completely out of operation in the first couple of hours of the attack, enabling Israeli aircraft to overfly Iran, to fly into Iranian airspace, certainly in the later stages of the operation, in a way that simply has not been the case previously. The Iranians claim that they've shot down, I believe, 2 Israeli fighter jets, and they claim that they've captured an Israeli pilot, a woman. The Israelis deny all of this. No doubt we'll be getting some clarity about this. But overall, it does seem as if, for several hours at least, the Iranian air defense system simply wasn't working. And there's a great deal of speculation as to why this was so, whether it was significantly damaged, as has been claimed in the past, by the Israeli strike on a Russian S-300 radar and missile battery back in October. The trouble with that argument is that however important and effective that S-300 missile battery actually is, and however much damage was really done over the course of that attack, we're not talking here about the entirety of Iran's air defense system. But the fact is that no part of it for several hours appeared to be working. And that, of course, begs a massive question: why? Bild Zeitung, the German newspaper, which is actually often very well informed about things and was apparently kept informed by the German authorities, say that what disabled the Iranian air defense system was a massive cyber attack carried out by the Israelis and perhaps by the Americans as well. And that seems to me as good an explanation as any. But gradually, over the course of the day, yesterday, we started to see parts of the air defense system start to come back into operation. It was all done in a very disorganized and gradual way. But if it was a cyber attack, or whether it, or maybe the confusion was caused by Israeli drone attacks on air defense installations, or who knows what the full explanation was. But anyway, gradually, though, as I said, in a fragmentary and disorganized way, we started to see the Iranian air defense system begin to resume its work. So it looks as if, to repeat again, Iran has come through the first day, maybe the hardest punch that Israel was able to launch against Iran, with its political leadership fully intact as far as I can see, with some of its top military officers killed but replaced, with several of its nuclear scientists killed. And here I should suggest that there's been major lapses in Iranian security. You would have thought that these people especially would be particularly well protected. But Iran is a big country with a large science and technology base. Nobody, I think, doubts that Iran would be able to find scientists to replace these people, especially since all the major breakthroughs have already been made, and with its nuclear sites largely intact. And it is hitting back, and, well, it may be, there's arguments about how effective the original missile strikes were, the first missile strikes were, but the fact is that they did take place, and they are hitting targets. They did hit, at any rate, if not targets, positions in Israel. Now, here I think an important point needs to be made, and it's a point that I've made before many times. Steve Witkoff apparently has also made it in conversations with US senators, but it's also starting to be alluded to in various Western media outlets. It's discussed in Russian media outlets, and I think that it's not ultimately controversial, which is that Israel is not in a position to sustain a long, drawn-out conflict with Iran. Iran is a far bigger country. Israel has a population of around 10 million people. Iran has a population of 90 million people. Israel is geographically a small country. Iran is a vast country. Israel has a sophisticated but small industrial base. Iran has a very large industrial base, some parts of which are less sophisticated than Israel's, but some parts of it are fairly sophisticated too. Iran, in other words, has far bigger resources, far more strategic depth than Israel does, provided the government retains its resolve and its control of the country and is able to resist steps being taken within Iran itself that might cause its overthrow. So the longer this operation, this conflict continues, and it's a point that we've made on the Duran in a live stream and in a program that Alex Christoforou and I did, the longer the conflict continues, and I've said that as well in programs here, the more the strategic balance will start to shift against Israel. Now, I've also received some information here from people who have been tracking the events of the last 24 hours. It's been pointed out to me that, for example, that the F-35 stealth fighters that Israel is increasingly relying upon to conduct deep strikes, and which now constitute a significant part of Israel's air force, are relatively fragile machines. They are not designed for long-term sustained conflict. And of course, if we come back to the question of Iranian missile strikes on Israel, and those strikes have now been supplemented by drone strikes. There's been pictures, I've seen one picture of the Iron Dome system, I believe, shooting down a Geran, or rather a Shahid drone over Israeli territory. Every Iranian missile that is launched at Israel, the Israelis try to shoot down. Apparently, one learns that 2 air defense missiles have to be used for there to be any serious chance of shooting down an incoming ballistic missile. Ballistic missiles being increasingly being difficult targets to shoot down. There is already a shortage of Patriot missile systems. The Russians calculate apparently that there are 3,000 Patriot missiles interceptors in existence around the world. Not all of them in Israel by any means. Not all of them in the United States by any means. Israel obviously has its own air defense systems, its Iron Dome, its David Sling, all of those systems. But of course it has a relatively small industrial base. The United States has a much bigger industrial base, but despite the drain of missiles caused by the conflict in Ukraine, and despite the urgency to increase production of air defense missiles, apparently Raytheon is simply not able to keep up, even with Ukrainian demand for Patriot missiles, let alone with any additional demand that Israel might face. So yes, for the moment, the Israelis are able to shoot down at least a proportion, maybe even the majority of Iranian missiles. But if the Iranians have as big a stockpile of missiles as they claim, and they're now saying that they can launch 2,000 ballistic missiles at Israel over the next couple of days, that may be a wild exaggeration for all I know, but let's say they do have large numbers of such missiles. Let's assume also that Iran has production facilities to build more of these missiles. It's plausible. Again, I'm not going to pretend that I know the details of the Iranian military industrial system, but it's logical to think that much of it will have been hardened and placed underground, and Iran, as an extremely mountainous country, is well adapted, has a geography that is well adapted to concealing and shielding industrial facilities. Anyway, let's assume that the Iranians can maintain over the duration missile strikes against Israel. Then there will come a point when air defense missiles start to run out. The United States will struggle to maintain supply, and then of course we will be faced with a strategic crisis. Now, I don't say this is going to happen in a few days. It may take weeks, may take months, but if there is an open-ended conflict, the risk of that is there. And of course, long before we reach that point, the anxieties and the concerns and the stresses will grow. And this may partly explain why we are seeing an escalation of rhetoric from the Israeli side. They're now talking about attacking Iran's oil industry, which of course they can do. They can certainly launch attacks on the oil refineries. But that would be, of course, a very significant blow to Iran and to its economy going forward. But given that Iran is now at war and is apparently self-sufficient in food and basic energy and can no doubt continue to receive help and assistance from some of its BRICS allies, will that be enough to force Iran, given that the Iranians are most probably going to start to mobilize their economy, their industrial system, to prioritize the war that they are now in? Is that going to be sufficient to stop the Iranians conducting strikes against Israel? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm going to guess no. And of course, attacking Iranian oil facilities does involve risks, because what if Iran, if it feels that its own energy facilities are being attacked, starts to take countermeasures against the oil and energy facilities of other countries, even countries like the Gulf states, with which currently Iran has good relations? I'm going to make a guess that for the moment the Iranians are very, very unwilling to do that. They probably do not want to jeopardize their relationship with their Gulf allies, or rather Gulf friends. They're not allies. But if a war becomes prolonged, then of course the imperative of war starts to switch in. And just as the Israelis might start taking ever more extreme and urgent measures to redress the shift in the balance, so the Iranians, if they feel under stress, might start to take action of their own. And it's been suggested that it's not just Iranian oil facilities across the Gulf that Iran might target, or the Straits of Hormuz, which Iran might close. It could also, for example, attack and disable, or at least inflict significant damage upon desalination plants, Saudi Arabia's desalination plants, which would be a major catastrophe for Saudi Arabia, just saying. So anyway, one way or the other, the Iranians do potentially have various cards that they could play, and they might feel under pressure to do that in the event that there was a long war. Now, that may explain why the Gulf states are now taking urgent diplomatic action. MBS has been very busy. He has been phoning Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, and Meloni in Italy. The UAE has also been very busy. Their foreign minister has been calling various European foreign ministers, and also Lavrov. All of them have been saying that they are strongly opposed to this Israeli attack on Iran. They've all condemned it. And one gets the sense that they are doing what they can to try to get this conflict stopped as soon as they can, before it escalates further, spirals further out of control. Whether they will be successful is an entirely different matter, but one can understand their nervousness. And anyway, this is, it seems to me, where we are with the conflict at the present time. Now, both the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Pezeshkian of Iran have also been busy phoning up their respective friends. I understand that the Iranians have been in contact with Pakistan, which is now pledging support apparently, and there's even stories, which I don't myself believe, that Pakistan is preparing to send fighter jets to defend Iran. I don't believe these stories, by the way. But anyway, interestingly enough, Netanyahu and Pezeshkian, over the course of yesterday, both called, or were called by, I'm not sure which it was, and spoke with one and the same person. And that was President Putin of Russia. And the call happened at 2010 Moscow time, fairly late in the evening. And it was very interesting to read the Russian readout. The Kremlin has provided a very detailed readout of these two conversations. And interestingly enough, it's provided a single readout covering both conversations at the same time. And the readout, the Kremlin readout, reads as follows. In light of the dangerous escalation resulting from Israel's act of force against Iran, Vladimir Putin had telephone conversations with President of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, and Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Now notice at the very first sentence, dangerous escalation resulting from Israel's act of force against Iran shows that Putin and the Russians unequivocally blame Israel for this latest escalation. And we're then told that the president of Russia expressed his condolences to the authorities and citizens over Iran, over the heavy death toll resulting from Israeli strikes, including among civilians. So condolences to Iran from Russia. And then we are further told that Vladimir Putin stressed that Russia condemned Israel's actions, which had been carried out in violation of the UN Charter and international law. The Russian side has been fully supporting the efforts to resolve the situation around Iran's nuclear program peacefully and had proposed concrete initiatives aimed at reaching mutually acceptable agreements. Russia will continue to promote a de-escalation between Iran and Israel. So, condemnation of Israel and a straightforward statement from Russia, from the president of Russia, that the Israeli action was a violation of international law and of the UN Charter. And a further statement from Putin that this was a completely inappropriate thing to do. The whole argument that this was a proper preemptive attack was completely wrong, because negotiations were in fact underway between Iran and the United States, with Russia also involved, to try to seek a diplomatic solution to any concerns provoked or which arose from the fact of Iran's nuclear program. I'll come to this shortly. And then we have Putin, the readout of Putin's comments, discussions with Netanyahu. In his conversation with the Prime Minister of Israel, the President of Russia emphasized the importance of resuming the negotiations and resolving any issues pertaining to Iran's nuclear program exclusively via political and diplomatic means. In addition, the Russian leader expressed willingness to provide mediation so as to prevent further escalation. And then we're told that it was agreed that the Russian side will maintain close contact with the authorities of both Iran and Israel with a view to resolving the present situation, which is fraught with the most disastrous consequences for the entire region. So Putin, it seems to me from this readout, was made pretty clear his anger about what had happened to Netanyahu, his strong disagreement, and that's an understatement, for what Netanyahu and the Israelis have been up to. And he's telling the Israelis to stop, and he's telling the Iranians that the Russians feel that the Iranians are in the right here and that the attack upon them was wrong. Now, yesterday there was a meeting at the UN Security Council, and both China and Russia weighed in pretty clearly on Iran's side. The Russians, by the way, broadened their criticism. They said that various Western powers had played a role in the Israeli attack on Iran, not just the United States. They said that some of the Israeli fighter jets that had participated in the attacks on Iran had used British bases in Cyprus. They also said that there'd been assistance afforded to Iran by France and Germany, Again, I'm not in any position to verify or corroborate any of this, but I've not seen any very strong denials from anybody in the West. So, strong statements from the Russians. Now, will they be backed by any further action? Now, I am going to suggest that they will be. And there are further factors to take into account here. Now, here I am going to disclose something which I have not mentioned before, but some time before, several days before the Israeli attack on Iran, I had been informed by a source who obtains information from Russia, from within Russia, that the Russians had come to the conclusion that the drone attack on the Russian air bases, Operation Spider's Web, had been conducted by Ukraine with help from Britain, certainly, with help from the United States, obviously, but with help from Israel also. That the Israelis played a significant part in the training of the Ukrainian operatives who carried out the attack, that they helped to plan the attack, that they suggested various means with which to conduct the attack, including the whole business of assembling drones, hiding them in containers, locating them, pre-positioning them close to Russian air bases, doing all of those sort of things. And I didn't pass on that information at the time because, well, I found it convincing, but always one has to worry about giving away information that might reveal the source. And it seemed to me that this was so sensitive information coming from within Russia that it seemed to me that if I did actually discuss this information in a program, that might lead to the Russian authorities putting two and two together and working out who that source is. Now, I think that is very unlikely now for one very simple reason, that if you go to the Russian media, you'll find that it is full of speculation about this, and it turns out that lots and lots of people in Russia had already been coming to this exact conclusion even before the Israeli attack on Iran had taken place. In other words, that Operation Spider's Web was conducted by Ukraine with a certain degree of Israeli involvement. Now, I want to stress, I don't know anything about this. I am simply passing on what various people are saying in Russia and what I believe the Russians themselves think. I don't know what role, if any, Israel had, because I have no access to any classified information, be it from inside Israel, from inside Russia, or from any such place. No one in the Russian security or intelligence services talks to me, and no one from the Israeli intelligence and security services talks to me. So I have no ability to verify any of this information. But the point is, and this is, I think, the key thing, many people in Russia believe it. And I suspect that it isn't just people in Russia who believe it, but people in authority in Russia who believe this. And I believe that that is going to harden Russian views. It explains, in part, the obvious coldness in the discussion between Putin and Netanyahu. But it also suggests very strongly that the Russians are indeed going to start taking steps to help Iran. Now, what steps will those steps be? Well, I'm going to suggest that initially, at least, these steps will not be very visible. The Russians are unlikely, for example, to supply complete air defense systems to Iran, at least not initially. But they will almost certainly provide intelligence. They were doing that apparently during the missile exchanges last year, and it's quite plausible that they will do this on a bigger scale now, and they are obviously in a position to do that. They have their eyes in the sky, they have their electronic and other intelligence on a much bigger scale than Iran can possibly do. And, well, if it is true that one of the reasons that the Iranian air defense system broke down because of an Israeli, and for all I know, joint Israeli and American cyber attack, as Bild Zeitung claims, and which I think perfectly plausible, then the Russians are in a position to help with that as well. Now, I say that, I would just mention something which most people appear to have forgotten and which is no longer talked about anymore. But I remember that way back in 2017, at the height of the Russiagate hysteria in the United States, the Washington Post published a bragging article. America publishes far too much bragging material, just to say. But anyway, they published a bragging article in which they said that Barack Obama, in one of the last steps that he had taken as president, had authorized the US intelligence community to riddle Russian infrastructure with all sorts of cyber bombs, which the United States would be able to detonate at will. And, well, after the start of the special military operation, I was waiting to see when those cyber bombs were going to be detonated by the United States. Cyber bombs that we were told, I remember reading in that article, could cripple large parts of Russia's infrastructure, and nothing like that happened. Now, there might be all kinds of explanations for this. It could be that the Russians threatened countermeasures if the United States did anything like that. But I think much more plausibly, given the entirely reckless way in which the Biden administration behaved throughout the entire period of the special military operation, the Russian counter-cyber operation services, about which I know absolutely nothing, but which I am going to guess are extremely well resourced and very efficient. Once they'd read that article in the Washington Post, went around searching for the cyber bombs and perhaps found them and disabled everyone. So I suspect that the Russians by now have a great deal of experience and knowledge in this sort of thing. They have brilliant programmers and people of that kind. And I suspect that they, and by the way, their Chinese friends, are probably well able to help Iran harden and proof its systems in ways that up to now Iran has simply been unable to do. Now, that now brings me to something else, because I noticed over the last 24 hours that a certain narrative has been spread quite widely across the internet. I've had people writing to me about it as well, about the supposed deception operation that the United States and Israel launched against Iran, which explained why Iran was caught by surprise by this Israeli attack. And a lot of this centers on portraying the US President Donald Trump as a Machiavellian character who supposedly deceived the Iranians into thinking that he was interested in a diplomatic solution to the crisis, even as he and the Israelis were cunningly working together to launch this attack on Iran. Now, the great problem I have with this entire theory is that I don't see any evidence of a deception operation at all. I say that because over the days preceding the attack on Iran, I was reading right across the Western media reports about how Israel was about to attack Iran. I was, in fact, so concerned about these reports that I discussed it briefly in one of my videos. I published it either a day or even 2 days before the attack took place. And over the course of a live stream on the Duran with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Sachs and I had a brief discussion in which we both expressed our very serious concern and worries that an attack upon Iran was or appeared to be imminent. And I had been reading, as everybody should, by the way, Larry Johnson's Sonar 21 blog. And can I just say, it's one of the best blogs around. And Larry Johnson, of course, is a former retired US intelligence officer, which I am not. And of course, he's been on his travels. He's been to Moscow, where he's met with all sorts of people, including Lavrov. And he was flying to Dubai. So he was not able to keep full track of everything. But I noticed that in one of his blogs, he too anticipated an attack on Iran and was concerned that the United States was probably going to participate in it. It is a utterly incompetent, completely bizarre deception operation that is conducted with all the details about it, the details that an attack on Iran is about to take place, being spread across the media. Surely, if there was a deception operation, the US and Israeli authorities would be going out of their way to keep reports of an Israeli attack on Iran entirely out of the media and to scotch any such reports by saying that if such reports were made, they were completely untrue. The United States was entirely focused instead on pursuing a diplomatic solution, something which never happened. So I can't see that there was any deception operation at all. If there was any element of surprise within Iran, if there was disorganization within Iran, and the evidence suggests that there was, then this, and one has to say this straightforwardly, points to dysfunction and disorganization within the Iranian security and political apparatus, a degree of disorganization and dysfunction, which unfortunately is not uncommon, but which tends to resolve itself over time during a time period of crisis, just to say, rather than to any cunning deception operation practiced by anybody. If Jeffrey Sachs, Larry Johnson, and myself could all see an attack coming, it is incredible that the Iranians could not see it also. Now, this view of Donald Trump as some kind of Machiavellian figure, I think originates in something completely different, which is that the United States clearly did give the green light to Israel to conduct this operation. And they didn't just give the green light, they facilitated it. They provided oil refueling, air refueling facilities to Israeli aircraft. They provided weapons to Israel to conduct this operation. They did all of those things, but they also attempted incompetently and unconvincingly to distance themselves from this whole operation. So we had that statement by Marco Rubio saying that this was entirely an Israeli unilateral action, that the United States itself was not involved. As I said, nobody in their senses would take that seriously. And of course, Donald Trump then completely undermined and sabotaged and torpedoed that whole cover story by, in effect, bragging after what he obviously thought was the success of the Israeli strikes, that he had been in on it all along. Again, if we have had disorganization, some degree of disorganization and dysfunction on the Iranian side, making possible the effective strikes, some of the more effective strikes that the Israelis carried out on the first day, we have abundant evidence of similar disorganization and dysfunction on the American side. The American side cannot even get its narrative sorted out. Is this a unilateral Israeli strike with the United States not involved? Is it all part of some cunning plan to put pressure on the Iranians to agree to negotiations? Did Donald Trump, what role did Donald Trump play? It is a shocking picture. Now, some people will say that this is some kind of apologia for the US government. How can it be? How can disorganization and incompetence and dysfunction on this kind of scale justify anything like that? And what it has done, to repeat again, is that it has created a situation now in which Israel is locked into some sort of long-term conflict with Iran. Already today, it's starting to look as if the assumption that Iran is going to collapse like a house of cards is most probably wrong. As I said, the Iranians have taken the blow, but they seem to be coming back, and the chances are that they will start to strengthen their response over the next couple of weeks, and that the balance of advantage is going to start to tilt in their favour. It's starting to look to me as if, again, different parts of the American government aren't in harmony with each other. They haven't really come up with any kind of agreed plan. And the result is that the United States is again being propelled into another forever war in the Middle East, which is exactly what the President Donald Trump said during his election he was going to avoid. To me, this is dreadful. It is awful. It suggests a government that has no control of its own foreign policy. As I said, if they'd planned deceitfully and duplicitly some kind of cunning attack on Iran, deceiving Iran in the way that, say, the Japanese are supposed to have done prior to Pearl Harbor, then they went about it in the most botched, incompetent and foolish way. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. I'm sure this narrative is going to continue, just as I see that there's another narrative that Israel, it's not Israel that's really attacking Iran, it's the United States. All I would say about that assumes that Benjamin Netanyahu, of all people, has no agency in this matter, and that he is essentially acting as a cat's paw for the Americans. This from someone who has been demanding an attack on Iran for all my adult life. Anyway, I just find that very difficult to accept or believe. As I said, we're already looking at disorganization and muddle and chaos on the American side. And I suspect that before very long, we're going to see the same muddle and chaos start to affect the whole way in which this thing is prosecuted, with already people like Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and other members of the MAGA base starting to speak out against this. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say at the moment. It is increasingly looking to me as if we're at the start of a very long war, a war of attrition. You can say goodbye to any idea of an Asia pivot, by the way. just to say, I mean, how can a thing like that happen if Israel and ultimately the United States are going to be dragged into a prolonged conflict with Iran, and Iran that is probably going to get an increasing amount of support from the BRICS powers, just to say. So an Asia pivot, you can forget it. And of course, the immediate big losers here are the Ukrainians, Zelensky, and potentially Taiwan. America already has depleted arsenals of key weapons, as President Trump himself has recently admitted. How is it going to replenish and restock them if it's now going to be involved in an open-ended conflict against a country of 90 million people in the Middle East? To repeat again, unless this operation succeeds quickly, this has all of the appearance of a debacle about it. And for the moment, all of the facts that I see point to a debacle, a long-term debacle, rather than a success. And as for the idea that the Iranians are going to be pressured into concessions, the Iranians have already said that they're pulling out of the meeting on Sunday in Oman, the meeting with Witkoff, and I understand that there's now serious talk in Iran of Iran pulling out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I suspect the Russians and the Chinese are going to beg the Iranians not to do. But if the Iranians do it, I would not be surprised. And that, of course, would take us down a whole new disastrous situation where the Americans and the Israelis really are going to find themselves facing the prospect of an Iranian nuclear bomb, with all of the difficult decisions that they're going to have to make about how they're going to deal with it. Anyway, that is the situation at the moment in the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and Iran. I don't think anybody within the administration has thought it through. How could they, when nobody is properly discussing this amongst each other? And it will be very interesting to see, to put it mildly, how this shapes out and whether the diplomatic steps being taken by people like MBS and possibly Vladimir Putin finally bring us all to our senses and end this conflict before further damage is done. There's one final point I do want to make, and it is one that again people bring up, which is why did Iran agree to negotiate with the United States at all? Why does Russia agree to negotiate with Ukraine? People, I think, get overworked about this. Every single conflict that I can think of since the end of the Second World War involves negotiations. I cannot see what benefit either Russia or Iran would derive from refusing to negotiate. In the one case with Ukraine, and in the second case with the United States. In the case of Iran especially, refusing to conduct negotiations, it seems to me would have further invited military action, and sanctions upon Iran, whilst potentially losing Iran friends. And I can't see why Iran would do that. If the Russians or the Iranians had made unwise concessions before coming to an agreement which, by the way, both with Ukraine, as we shall see, and with the United States for Iran, is completely out of sight now. If the Russians and the Iranians had made unwise concessions, like, say, in the case of the Russians, agreeing to a 30-day ceasefire, or in the case of the Iranians, agreeing to cease nuclear enrichment and open more of their sites to inspection, then I can see that there might have been a point. But the fact is that the Iranians and the Russians have made no such concessions. All they have done is talk, and I can't really see how that can be faulted or why that was wrong. In the case of Iran, the fact that this attack took place immediately before a meeting between the United States and Iran was due to happen, well, that puts them in a stronger legal and diplomatic position, as Vladimir Putin appears to have pointed out to Benjamin Netanyahu over the course of their call yesterday. Anyway, let's move on and let's now turn to the other conflict, which is the one in Ukraine, where, interestingly enough, we are having some important developments. The first is that, exactly as the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, said, despite an enormous degree of reluctance to do so on the part of the Ukrainians, they have now started to accept the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers that are being returned to Ukraine from Russia. Ian Proud, the British diplomat, has an excellent piece about this on his blog, The Peacemonger, which I would strongly advise people to read. It discusses all of this in great detail and explains some of the reasons why Ukraine was probably deeply reluctant to accept these bodies. But anyway, it is now happening. And as I said, the Ukrainians seem to be very grudging and unhappy about the whole operation, though they're also, it should be said, going ahead with the prisoner exchange as well. But all of this is coming with further strong statements from Zelensky and Sybiga, the Ukrainian foreign minister, which makes it clear that Ukraine has in effect pulled out of the Istanbul talks. Zelensky says that the Istanbul talks are leading nowhere. He's not interested in them anymore. All he's getting are ultimatums from the Russians. The talks, Ukraine's participation in the talks has accordingly finished. And the only circumstance in which Ukraine is now prepared to talk to the Russians at all is if the Russians come round and start talking about a ceasefire. That is all he is prepared to concede. He is not prepared to concede anything substantive whatsoever. I expect that is going to remain the Ukrainian position, regardless of what happens on the battlefields, even if the Russians not only reach the Dnieper, but actually cross it, even if they start capturing Odessa and places like that, even if the Russian army reaches the gates of Kiev itself, even if Zelensky flees Ukraine and establishes his government in exile in perhaps London, I don't believe that Zelensky, whilst he remains president of Ukraine, is ever going to make the kind of necessary concessions needed to end the war. And I suspect that in that stance, he is going to continue to get his support from his European friends. Ian Proud, by the way, has written also another follow-up piece speculating that one of the reasons that the Europeans want to prolong the war in Ukraine is that they don't want to act on their promises that Ukraine join the European Union, because they know that such a thing would be completely unaffordable and might bankrupt the European Union and precipitate its collapse. If that is true, and I'm not saying it's not true, then that is one of the most cynical and deplorable things I have ever heard. All I would say is there's lots of cynicism around in the international system at the moment, and the fact that it might be cynical and deplorable doesn't mean that it isn't true, and if it is true, it wouldn't surprise me. Anyway, let's actually now move on and discuss the military situation on the battlefields, and I'm going to do it briefly because obviously I've had to devote most of this program to the situation in the Middle East, to the unfolding disaster that we're going to see there. A disaster, by the way, which has its humanitarian dimension as well. Obviously, the conflict in Gaza continues. The Israeli siege of Gaza continues. I understand that many Israelis still have not felt able to return to northern Israel. Not that I'd put that on anything like the same level as the situation in Gaza. And of course, it's increasingly looking as if, far from resolving Israel's problems, the collapse of the Assad government in Syria has simply opened up another front for Israel to fight on, which is what we're starting to see play out there. But anyway, I've had to spend most of this program talking about that, so I'm not going to have the same amount of time as I should do discussing the situation on the Ukrainian battlefields, or what would like to do. Can I say that, in fact, over the last 48 hours, we're now starting to see a decisive shift. The Wall Street Journal has already said that in May, Russia captured more Ukrainian territory than it has done in any single month since the first few months, the first 2 months of the special military operation, since February and March 2022, in other words. I've been making this point in many programs that, contrary to this being an incremental Russian advance, the Russian offensive is continuing to gain momentum, and we are starting to see this play out all over the battlefield. Not only have the Russians made significant progress in Sumy region, especially since the capture there of the village of Yablunovka, but they have made significant advances in the northwest Oskol, northwest of the Oskol River, where they established their bridgehead some months ago. They apparently are now advancing towards Kupiansk also from the east, but the consensus now seems to be that the major priority for the Russians in Kharkiv region is to capture the whole of northeast Kharkiv region, putting the Russians in a strong position to attack the city of Kharkiv itself, which would be a critical event for Ukraine were it ever to happen. Elsewhere, it looks as if the Russians have now conclusively captured the village of Grigorovka, northeast of Siversk. They already now control the other village of Verkhokamyanska, and there are reports also that the Russians have reached and are storming another village immediately to the north of Siversk called Serebyanka. It is widely acknowledged that if the Russians capture all of these 3 villages, the Ukrainian position, the Ukrainian defenses in Siversk, will start to collapse. And of course, there continue to be claims that the Russians control Torske to the east of Siversk, though there are other claims that the Ukrainians have retaken Torske, claims which, by the way, I don't myself believe. But anyway, that's been reported by some Ukrainian channels. But anyway, all of this is bad, but far, far worse is what is happening in other places. Firstly, yesterday, Redovka all but said that the Battle of Chasiv Yar is now over. They say that the Russians not only control around 95% of Chasiv Yar, but that they are preparing to make further advances west of Chasiv Yar, and that the remaining Ukrainian defenders of the few remaining buildings on the western outskirts of Chasiv Yar are going to have no option soon but to retreat. Well, all that is bad enough, but perhaps much worse is what is happening south of Konstantinovka. And here I'm going to say that some genuine mystery is unfolding, because it's a mystery that the Russians themselves are talking about. South of Konstantinovka, there is a large water reservoir called the, I believe it's the Kilmanbek Reservoir. I may be getting its name wrong. I probably am. Now, the point is that the Ukrainians have been attempting to hold all kinds of positions south of this reservoir. This is the area from which the Ukrainians attempted a few weeks ago their various counterattacks to try to recapture parts of Toretsk. The counterattacks which were intended to persuade people in the West that the Battle of Toretsk was still underway. And for the moment, it seems the Ukrainians are not withdrawing from this area south of this reservoir. And several thousand Ukrainian troops, by most accounts, are located there. The trouble is that the reservoir is by definition an all but impassable obstacle. If the Ukrainians have to retreat north, the reservoir is in their way. The trouble is that the Russians are now very close to reaching the eastern end of the reservoir, and they are not far from the western end of the reservoir either. And it seems as if the Russians already have effective artillery and drone control of any remaining escape routes that the Ukrainian troops could use to flee their positions south of this reservoir. It's as if the Ukrainian command has decided to sacrifice these troops south of the reservoir by leaving them in some kind of a cauldron. Quite what the logic of doing this is, I am completely unsure. Whether it's intended to buy time, I can't understand. But since these are veteran Ukrainian troops, and since Ukraine is having a recruitment crisis, I simply don't understand the logic of it, and I don't think anybody else can. And, well, all of that is pretty terrible altogether, but yesterday there were reports that the Russians have also captured more territory to the northeast of Bakrovsk, that they have, to be precise, captured a village called Koptyevo, which is located considerably to the northeast of Bakrovsk. It looks to me again as if the encirclement of Mercouris, or rather, perhaps one should say more accurately, the encirclement of the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk is now well underway, and maybe there is some logic in the Ukrainians still holding on to Pokrovsk. But again, I wonder whether Zelensky and Syrskyi are ever going to pull them out in time. This is a much more dangerous encirclement situation than the one the Ukrainians faced in Bakhmut, for example, back in 2023. And I don't see any sign that the Ukrainians are doing anything to prevent it. And we now not only have abundant footage confirming Russian control of the important fortified town of Komar, in the southwest Donbass area, but I've noticed that the Ukrainians themselves, Ukrainian reports themselves, are acknowledging that the Russian advance in Dnipropetrovsk region is not only faster than we have seen previously in Donbass, but the absence of fortifications, of dense urban landscapes such as there are in Donbass, of natural obstacles, rivers and streams and forests, all but guarantee that the Russian advance in Dnipropetrovsk region is going to be even faster. Again, we are looking at what is starting to appear like an irresistible Russian advance in this area, one that is gaining territory by kilometers every single day. Now, I remember saying back in the summer of last year, at the time of the collapse of Ukrainian defenses west of Avdiivka, that there didn't seem to me to be a full acknowledgement in the West of quite how bad the situation for the Ukrainian army was becoming. And it seems to me that this is even more true now, except that we are not late in the summer, as was the case when I said that last year, but we are early in the summer. We're still in June. And if the Russian advance right across the conflict line continues at this rate, at the rate it is going over the last couple of weeks, if it continues like this for the rest of the summer, then I think there's a chance not just that the Dnieper will be reached in its central areas, but that the entire territory of Ukraine east of the Dnieper will be at the very least in jeopardy, but conceivably even lost to Ukraine as well before the end of the year. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon, obviously. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work by going to our shop. Links under this video, and don't forget also, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.